going to begin this hour with new details in a nearly 40-year-old double murder case uncovered by a pair of podcasters. Now, the victims, Derek and Nancy Haysom, were found stabbed to death in their Virginia home. This was back in 1985. Their daughter, Elizabeth, and her then-boyfriend, his name is Yen Soring, were eventually arrested and they were charged. Now, Elizabeth pleaded guilty to accessory to murder before the fact, and Soring was found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. But when 2 small-town podcast hosts started examining this case, new questions came to light. Our Nikki Battiste spoke to the podcasting team and the man convicted of the crime.
So what's the truth? This is small town, big crime.
Did you ever imagine that this podcast would take on the life that it has?
No, we never dreamed that this podcast would turn into what it turned into. We started thinking that we were just going to have this fun little side project. I feel like you definitely had the best relationship with him.
Podcast hosts Rachel Ryan and Courtney Stewart's side project has morphed into 3 years of serious investigative work.
How would you describe the exhaustive investigative work you and Courtney have done?
We have tracked down new witnesses. We were able to collect DNA from 3 possible alternate suspects. And then we spent a year and a half putting together this request and this process to request new DNA testing.
2 DNA experts hired by Yen's team say it shows 2 unidentified men bled at the scene.
With the help of narrator Jacqueline Piermarini, Ryan and Stewart have reinvestigated the case and released their findings on their podcast, Small Town, Big Crime.
This case is in the public eye, and it has continued to be for decades.
The 1985 murders of Derek and Nancy Haysom captivated Virginia. They were found stabbed in their Bedford home.
This is the dining room in here.
Former Bedford County Deputy Chuck Reed was one of the first detectives at the crime scene.
Describe what you saw at the crime scene.
Well, just as you step into the front door, Mr. Haysom was lying just inside the living room, just out of the dining room, in a pool of blood. And when you go into the kitchen, Miss Haysom was lying in the kitchen in a pool of blood.
The Haysoms had 6 children between them. Their only child together was their youngest, Elizabeth. At first, there were no obvious suspects, but over the next few months, Elizabeth and her then-boyfriend, 18-year-old Yen Soring, came under suspicion.
Elizabeth started to get on police radar when family members reported that she was acting a little strange and saying strange things about the death of their parents. And then they knew that her boyfriend was Yen Soring. They were both students at the University of Virginia.
A few months after the murders, Bedford County detectives asked the German-born Soring to come in for an interview.
What was your impression of Jens when you first met him?
The first thing hit me in my mind and gut, no way. There's no way this little boy did that kind of damage. He was just a little wimpy, little rosy-cheeked little 18-year-old kid. My gut feeling just said there's no way this young man did that.
When they asked him to give fingerprints and footprints, he declined and said he would come back a few weeks later after his exams, and then that's when he and Elizabeth fled the country.
The young couple spent months on the run using false identities. They were eventually arrested in London about a year after the killings.
Detectives in London arrested them on bank fraud charges. And then when the detectives went back to the apartment where they were staying, they found a travel diary. And in the travel diary hinted at something much worse than bank fraud. And that's when the detectives in London called Bedford County and asked if there was a couple that had been murdered, because they believed they had the killers.
Once in police custody, Soring confessed to killing the Haysoms.
What is Jens' very first account of what happened to the Haysoms?
He said he did it because they didn't approve of his relationship with Elizabeth, and that he murdered them, and that he did it alone.
At trial, Soring recanted and said he confessed to protect Elizabeth, whom he claimed was likely the real killer, from getting the death penalty. He said he believed he had diplomatic immunity.
And he believed that as a German citizen with a father in the government, that he would be sent back to Germany to serve out his sentence. And in Germany, his sentence would have been much lighter.
But he wasn't sent to Germany, and in 1990, Elizabeth took the stand and said she manipulated Soring into killing her controlling parents.
I thought I could help Elizabeth and protect her life, and that I would only spend roughly 10 years in a German youth prison in order to save her life.
Soaring spent nearly 30 years in prison, but he and Elizabeth were released in 2019 on parole. But Soaring wanted a pardon.
Read something and sign something, right?
He was deported to Germany, where we spoke with him over Zoom.
Did you murder Nancy or Derek Haysom?
Absolutely not.
Over the years, Soaring has often appeared in interviews. He's asked for new DNA testing or a new trial to clear his name.
Somebody washed off blood in the showers. This was nowhere in my confession.
He has high-profile supporters like author John Grisham.
We're here to dig through the evidence to figure out what really happened the night Derek and Nancy Haysom were murdered.
With all the renewed attention, in came the podcast team, who wanted to try to settle who killed the Haysoms once and for all.
When we started looking at this case, it was obvious that there was pieces of the puzzle were missing. And we thought the best way to kind of put the puzzle together would be doing additional DNA testing.
Have you been more surprised or not on what you've found?
I think there's been a lot of surprises over the course of this investigation.
And that's where we pick up tomorrow with part 2 of this story. We will show you new debates about DNA testing in this case, and we'll have more of our interview with Jens Soaring. After her release from prison, Elizabeth Haysom was deported to Canada, where she has citizenship. We were unable to get in touch with her directly, but a close relative told us she has no comment. And it's really important to point out, when these murders happened in the 1980s, DNA testing was really in its infancy. So a lot has changed since then.
Yeah, were there other potential suspects here?
So Jens Soaring's legal team has always pointed to 2 other men, and the podcasters Rachel and Courtney actually tracked them down, family members down, and were able to collect their DNA as well. We'll find out what those results are also tomorrow.
Well, Nikki, we see in this side shot of you that baby is cooking and almost ready.
Hopefully I'll be here tomorrow.
How much more time do you have? Do you mind saying?
About 2.5 weeks.
2.5 weeks. You look great.
You look
I can't
great.
wait.
You look radiant. You look great.
Thank you. Maybe it'll happen right here on CBS Mornings.
Well,
We would be very grateful.
I'd be very grateful if you
we would be very grateful.
it would be amazing. Is that coming up part 2 tomorrow?
Yes.